Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MTNA National Conference. My name is Scott Price, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here to today's question and answer panel on teaching students who need adaptive pedagogy and who have varying types of special needs. My colleagues joining me are Beth Bauer from Wheaton College, Melissa Martiros from Anna Maria College, and Derek Polischuk from Michigan State University. So we're very happy to be answering your questions today, and please enjoy this session. When we do this session in person, we usually begin with the next slide, and this is just to give a little bit of context for the answers that we're going to be giving today. So as we answer your questions, we always want to make sure that we give time for a complete answer and respect for everyone involved in the process. And as you know, that is just crucial for all of our students as well. We always try to approach our teaching and our answers with open hearts, open minds, and we always try to use person-first language. And just as a refresher, person-first language means saying student with autism or student with a visual impairment instead of blind child or autistic child. We always want the person to come first and to allow any diagnosis or any label to inform our pedagogy and not to color or bias our thinking about the person. And then we want to keep a focus on practical and adaptive pedagogy because I know that's what we're all here for today. So thank you very much, and I think we'll begin the panel.
So our presentation and our conversation will follow this order today. We'll do a response to previously submitted questions on labels. We'll move into sequencing, different methods, behavior, physical technique, reading, rhythm, recital preparation and performance, and collaboration. As we go through the slides, I'll read the question out loud, and then the panelists will kind of flow through their responses as they arise through the process of the presentation. This is one of the most common questions that we receive when we do these panels, and also I think when my colleagues and I do any kind of conference session or seminar on working with children with special needs or inclusive piano teaching, and it's always around labels. And how do you approach a parent who has not been upfront about the child having a disability or presenting the label to you of their child prior to the start of lessons? Anyone want to take this one?
I can do it. You as a teacher are going to have training that you will see potential things that could be a label a child has. And so you teach to the child. And I teach to the child's strengths. And then where there are areas that I see there are challenges, I do what I would do for accommodating anyway. I wouldn't necessarily wait for a parent to tell me there's a label. But if it gets to a point that I still feel that something's not adding up, I would go to a parent and I would say, have you ever noticed this in Johnny's behavior or Susie's behavior? Has any other teacher commented on it? And if the parent answers yes, then I'll say, oh, what were the strategies they were using in school, church, wherever, so that I can keep consistency in the piano studio.
Thank you, Beth.
I would agree with Beth. We certainly do this with all of our students. We begin to adapt and modify our pedagogy to meet that student's needs. And in addition to Beth, I would also add that sometimes the parents may not yet know that their child is having some challenges, or they may be in denial about it for any number of reasons that come from a very good place, or they may be so overwhelmed right now that they just are not able to approach telling the teacher anything about their child. So I usually do what I would do with any other student, is just start to adapt my pedagogy to meet that student's needs and to make sure that they have the best experience possible with their music study.
Thank you, Scott.
I think I would start by saying that this has never happened to me. And having worked with students with special needs for a long time, I think that might be a sign that it's not a very common problem, fortunately. But I think that I would just re-emphasize what Scott and Beth said. These are great answers about teaching to the student. It's something that we do with all of our students. And I think that not necessarily putting a student with a label into a category can be a very positive thing for a student with special needs.
I think I would also say that I'm a piano teacher. I am not a psychiatrist. I am not a specialist, a medical specialist in autism. So it is inappropriate for me to actually make a diagnosis for a parent. This is a team of professionals who need to do this, and it is not ethically correct for me to engage myself in that process. However, I can approach it, as we all have said so far, and I certainly can adapt my pedagogy if I suspect the child may be dealing with some sort of a challenge.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think I might follow up with two more points. One is that we host a blog through the Francis Clark Center on inclusive piano teaching, and there is a write up on labels that I think is worth referencing in this context. The other is the function of labels. Typically, are for the provision of services, either medical or in the schools. A child needs a label legally for the schools to provide special accommodations and services. But in the context of the piano studio, the labels become somewhat insignificant. They're not needed for any kind of service provision. And usually if you put the labels aside, you still have the manifestation of the various disabilities. So if you are teaching to if you're focused on the pedagogy and the work itself, you're going to accommodate the various behaviors or challenges that the student faces in the studio, and you're going to do that with or without the label. So the label itself isn't necessary in the context overall. So that's where I stand on that. Anyone have anything else to say about that, or should we move on to the next question?
I just kind of view the label as a tool. I like all of you are saying I don't need it, but it's a tool where I might go look at something. And to reiterate what Melissa says, if the child has not been officially diagnosed or a parent hasn't shared it with a school district, there will not be any accommodations. But we can make all the accommodations we want in the studio setting to help the child succeed.
Great, thank you. I need to apologize for just a split second here because I have animals in the background who are fighting in this moment, which are the perils of Zoom. So I keep trying to find the right mute button, and every time I look for the mute button, I fast forward the slides. So I think I figured it out, and I apologize for being annoying and disruptive. So moving on to collaboration. The first question that we've streamed through in the past: how closely are you able to work with school psychologists, counselors, parents, and other support staff?
I think it depends on the district, the state. Many parents have signed a waiver that I can talk with their child's staff at school if the staff is willing. The other thing that parents will do is they will share with me their child's IEP or 504, and I'll take the things that I get from that and then see what I can apply into the piano studio.
Beth, can you elaborate on what the IEP is?
The IEP is a legal document that a school district puts together that's based on a child's disability label. A team of people, and these will be all the people that work with the child at the school, will get together and come up with goals and objectives that the child will have in every single area of their school day. This includes behavior, PE, music, art, and then any of their subjects. If they have any special things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, there will be goals for that too. And just by me reading through that document, it can give me some clues for things, especially on fine and gross motor, how the child does in regular reading class. And then the math IEP can be of great use to me. And then behavior, if there's a behavior plan that's put together in the IEP, I'll use the exact same behavior plan and expectations in the studio.
So the IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan, and it is a legally binding document, but I do the same. So for me, I think it probably depends on whether you're teaching in a large city or a small town. So I'm in a small town currently, and most of the students who come to my house are from the local school, which is it's quite small comparatively, where Beth is like on the outskirts of Chicago. So in that context, everyone kind of knows everybody, and it's a lot easier for the parents to put me in touch with school psychologists, music teachers, support staff. But even in that context, I don't work directly with them. I work basically indirectly through them, through the parent. So parent is my correspondent in all of my communication, and the IEP they are helpful documents to read, provided that the parent gives them to you.
I work primarily with the parents as well. And usually, if they share the IEP with me, that's wonderful. And also, they will share with me things that the students are working on with their other therapists as well. But parents are my best teachers, they are my best support system. And I usually go to them for just about everything. They can be wonderful educators themselves and helping me adapt and deal with crafting an experience that is best for the children.
Yeah, a trend I've noticed is that special needs parents tend to be particularly dedicated people in their child's lives, um, at least the ones that I've worked with. And so working with these people is a really indispensable link into finding how to really reach that child in their music lessons.
And I would also say that on our virtual program for this Pedagogy Saturday track, we had a wonderful music therapist who presented a session, and she has worked with some of my students in the past. And so a music therapist can be a wonderful support. And while they have different goals than we do as piano teachers, there certainly is some overlap, and we can help them and they can assist us with different skills.
Great. The next question, should parents attend lessons?
Well, I want parents there as much as possible until the student chooses not to have them there, or it's usually a discussion between the students and their parents when they're old enough to start handling the situation by themselves. And I want them there for many reasons. Number one, simply as a support for their child, so their child feels safe, so they can educate me and help me crafting my experience for the students. They can also teach me about language, things that need to be adapted. They can teach me about behavioral things that need to be managed. They can manage behaviors during the lesson. Um, and then also that I feel that they need to be there because they watch the instructional process and then they can assist in the practicing and the learning at home.
I agree. My parents are there. Even the only time parents aren't there is if it's a hindrance and it's a conversation that all of us have together. But like Scott was saying, I need the parents to understand what's going on so that we're all using similar language, so that when they practice, it goes very smoothly. The other thing I do is, especially with the Zoom lessons, the parents are all attending because they're writing down the assignments right now. And if they don't, I'm texting them the assignment, or I'm sending them a video of the pieces the kids are working on with how I want the different things to be played.
Yeah, I love to have parents in all lessons, whether it's with a special needs student or a student that is neurotypical. I just think that the investment that a parent sort of is forced to give by being present in the lesson really leads to a lot of dividends at home in the practicing.
I agree with all of that. And I especially agree when I have a child who has behavioral issues. I find it really helpful when the parent is present in the room. How do we help overwhelmed parents practice with their children and keep the atmosphere positive and light?
One of the things I do is most of my parents come in with these preconceived notions as to what they should do for practicing based on their previous experiences or what their friends are telling them their kids are doing. And the first thing I tell them is, well, no, we're not setting a timer. And I give a very detailed lesson plan page when we were all in person. And I still do that with the emails. And I tell them exactly how to practice. I also tell them that the beginning of the week is going to seem like you're at the piano longer than toward the end of the week when we're getting closer to the piano lesson. And my biggest thing is my kids are doing a whole lot more things after school that are strategies of there are things like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy. So I feel that coming to piano is something that they're doing like their peers who are typical. So I try to make it as less stressful as possible and tell the parents, I know you're going to have a bad week. Or if it's a week where there's a huge behavior outburst, dealing with behavior comes before dealing with piano. So that's how I try to keep the parents calmer. I also tell the parents that they are always welcome to video what's going on in practicing and text it to me, and I'll give them feedback.
I think two principles that tend to help the practicing at home in terms of keeping the atmosphere positive are consistency, just making sure that it's happening every day, even if it's not a really fleshed out long practice session, but that it's consistent. And then also just goal setting, really making very clear things that students can achieve every single week, and the positivity of that between lessons can really pay off a lot.
I agree. Specificity and routine and step-by-step practices are very important in my lessons and practice sessions with students. And I also feel that my teacher persona is also very important. I need to always be the calm rock within the lesson, no matter what is happening. My face needs to be positive in its expression. My voice needs to be positive in its expression. The choice of vocabulary needs to be very direct and specific. And if I'm very attentive to those things, I find that it creates that entire environment within which my student can thrive and feel that they are safe. And it helps alleviate any anxiety, which can lead to a host of other problems.
I agree with all of that. I think that one of the things that I try to focus on more and more as I advance through my work professionally is how to be disarming. So in terms of like my own, I guess maybe to speak to Scott's point about persona, teaching persona, but a lot of times we can create defensiveness in others without even realizing it, just based on the way that we sort of hold ourselves or the way that we speak. And especially going into lessons with parents of children with special needs, how can I approach the relationship and the conversation with them in a way that I myself am disarming? And one of the ways I think that we can do that is to really think about our own sort of pressure to be the expert in the room. I think that as piano teachers, we're very used to being the ones that know. We have the content knowledge, we have the expertise, and our sort of self expectation is that we go into these lessons presenting that expertise. But the reality is, when we're going into these lessons with children of various needs, the way that it's going to look with each child is going to be different, and we're probably going to flop all over ourselves before we find the right approach that's going to work with each individual child. If we can sort of eliminate our own sort of internal defenses in response to not actually knowing what we're doing, and also become comfortable with relying on the parents as the experts of the children, I think we can set the stage for the environment to be a lot lower in pressure, and we can try to be disarming so that when parents are overwhelmed, we're not contributing to the overwhelmed response by adding our own sort of anxieties and insecurities about what it is that we're doing to the context. Okay, so should we move on to the next slide? Okay. Sequencing. What is the typical length of lessons for children with special needs?
Well, I think at least in my studio, that varies. And it typically is what is right for that student. I have some students who will come twice a week for an hour in the past. I have some students who take an hour lesson, others 45 minutes. The majority probably take a 30-minute lesson. And for younger students, sometimes they have come twice a week for 15 minutes. And it just depends upon the student and what their needs are and what they can handle and how the step-by-step lesson routine needs to be crafted for them. So it varies in my class.
I agree with Scott. I've had students, even older students, I don't necessarily look at chronological age. I look more at their concentration age. And so I might have a child or a student who's 13 years old chronologically, but I need to base what I'm teaching on a 15-minute lesson. And I may have to add breaks into the lesson. But if we start with a 15-minute lesson, we will gradually move into a 30-minute lesson. And then for kids who are playing more difficult repertoire, we will then maybe do a 45-minute lesson or hour lesson, the same way you would sequence a lesson for a child who is typical.
One thing I could add to this would be that, I've having taught students with autism individually in applied settings as well as in group settings. Sometimes when students are in group settings, if they're sort of moving between modalities quickly, different people playing and making comments, sometimes that can lengthen the amount of time. The other thing I would just add is that I think sometimes, at least with students with autism, people are, I think people who are neurotypical get sort of sell them a little short in terms of what they're capable of in terms of time and concentration. I've always been pleasantly surprised by how a student will really keep their attention through an hour lesson, when I've been given a lot of warnings by other people about those kind of lengths. So, sometimes look on the bright side of what's possible here.
I still kind of keep most of mine to 30 minutes. And I think what's more important is how the structure inside the lesson is. I use schedules, I use physical written out schedules, and try to sort of segment things so that the flow is consistent across lessons, and also that there is an expectation set up in the student for how the lesson is going to go. I find I guess maybe I'm not working necessarily with more advanced children with special needs. So if I try to fill a 45-minute lesson, a lot of that ends up getting filled with games and things that don't necessarily feel like worthy of the parent's financial investment in that context. So I guess I'm with Beth on the attention sort of age, the capacity for focus. And then within that 30 minutes, making sure that it's structured in such a way that there's consistency across all areas.
I think
You
I
fill the
agree
lesson
very
time.
much that
Sorry, go ahead, Scott. Go
I
ahead.
agree very much that I believe I agree very much in that it's in the structure of the lesson and not so much the time to worry about. And in that structure, while it can be very, very detailed and step by step, sometimes there needs to be just empty time, but that doesn't mean that it's empty time. Sometimes our students may have auditory processing issues and also cognitive issues. And so we just need to give them time to make sure that they've heard a word, that they understand the meaning of the word, and they understand it in context, then give them time to process that meaning, turn it into a physical motion that they will have to do at the keyboard, and then coordinate their fine motor skills to be able to achieve that at sound. And then time for me to give them assurance that what they just tried to do was great. Even if it's incorrect and undesirable, I will still say, you know what, you get the award for being the best trier today. Do you think we can try again? And always make it positive. So sometimes if I'm sitting there for 20 seconds doing nothing, that doesn't mean that's an empty 20 seconds. It may be very necessary for that child to be successful.
Great.
Are we on the
Yeah.
filling? Okay. I use a schedule, and the schedule is posted on the wall, and I use pocket schedule cards that any classroom teacher is accustomed to seeing. And so I have some laminated cards with different things, and some things that are consistent amongst all students is that we start a lesson with a bow. The physical activity of taking the bow helps to focus the lesson and is a physical indicator to the child it's now time to start. I do not do the bow until I have asked them a couple questions, a couple of their questions like they're working on for school, their W questions and their H questions. So I will say, how are you today? And, or I'll say, ask them about what was something you learned at school today, but I try to avoid yes, no answers so that they're giving me some actual feedback. Or if there was something that they told me about the week before, I try very hard to remember it and ask them, how did that go that you were telling me about last week? Then as soon as they know, as soon as I say the word bow, that means it's time to go to our lesson. And I will always start our lesson with, and I use very simple prompts to help the child. So it goes bow, play piano, new learning, flashcards. Sometimes we have a workbook for the kids who have a workbook, which is just theory, or game. We always end the lesson with their sticker chart where they get some positive feedback telling them how many stickers they got for the week. And then we take another bow, and that's another physical indicator that piano time is over, and they may ask me something else. Sometimes you will have times where you've got this perfect schedule put up together and it doesn't work. Or they get stuck on something and they keep telling me, Miss Beth, da 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 da. And I'll say, I'll use an if then statement or a first then statement. And I'll say, first, you play piano, then you may tell me what you wanted to tell me. Or if you play piano, then you can say something. And these are common things that they're using in school and are learning.
I'm with you on that, Beth, with the schedule and the structure and the routine.
Yeah, 200% with the schedule. And I also have that beginning chat with all of my students. They know that that is part of the lesson. And it's designed to teach them social communication skills and behavioral skills. And so they can practice those things. It's also designed to teach them behaviors on how to get ready to learn. And many of our students will have hypersensitivity issues. So it's also a chance for them to sort of desensitize from all the sounds they experienced and all the smells and the lighting and anything that has happened on the way up to the studio. And so they just have a chance to calm down, to get centered, to practice their skills, to feel like they are part of a process and to know what's coming next. And then just like Beth, I will say, okay, are you ready? And if I get that yes, I know they are inviting me into their learning space. And if they say no, then we'll take a break and then ask them if they are ready again. And if they say no again, then I have to decide if they really aren't ready or if this is just an avoidance behavior.
I also have a place on the schedule cards where there's a card that says break, that they know that anytime they need to take a break, they can either say the word break, Miss Beth, or go grab the card if they're nonverbal. Or if a child is nonverbal, I use their assistive technology device, and we have a piano page in there. There is a section in my office that is break time. It's got fidget toys, the trampoline. There's even balls that we can throw at a cabinet. And the purpose of that is not lost on just throwing a ball. It's helping to mimic hand position, but they don't know that. So we'll keep that secret to all of us right now. But there's very purposeful things in what I pick as the fidgets. So we're strengthening fine motor. And it's been proven in research that the physical activity of doing the jumping on the trampoline and getting up and moving will help with focus. There's a whole movement program called Brain Gym out there, and there's different exercises that we can do in the classroom or in the studio that help to refocus when we need those breaks.
Great stuff, Beth.
Yeah. Do you make sure the student is advancing equally in all areas or allow them more challenging experiences in the areas that come more easily to them?
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of have to balance it. It's kind of like when you're feeding your own children, do you let them not have vegetables just because they say they don't like them, or do you let them try them? So I will always, as we were earlier talking, I want lessons to end on a positive note, and I want there to be positivity in the lesson. So I will always start and end with the easiest areas for the student so that they leave positive, but you have to push and do it cautiously and carefully. And that's why I have that card called New Learning, because that a lot of my kids have a natural fear of failure, and fear of failure is typically around new concepts. And so since we know that, we can help them prepare by having on the schedule new learning. Or I'll pick phrases when I'm going back in to correct something if it doesn't go well. And I'll say something like, could we try an experiment here? And by using experiment, it's a prompt or an indicator that it means we're going to do something different and Miss Beth's going to correct something, but correction doesn't mean bad. And that usually it has gone well to this point. Now I'll probably jinx it and then something will blow up this week, but to this point, saying, let's try an experiment. We're going to see what happens when you add the forte. And then we remind them, what does forte mean? They know it. And I'll say, can you point to the forte in the score? So what should you do there? I should play it loud, Miss Beth, and then we do it. So you help to take away some of the tensions or the anxiety producing things.
Yes, to all of that. I think also this is where it becomes really important to be organized. So assuming that you're working with a schedule, my schedules are divided amongst by like development areas. So rhythm, note reading, scales or finger exercises, and repertoire. So if I'm working within an organized way with a student, I know where they are in each individual area, and then what the progression is sort of a month from now, 2 months from now, 3 months from now. So I'm sort of moving in that direction. It might be that rhythmically, notationally, and then with exercises and repertoire, they're moving at different levels. You won't necessarily be able to open a lesson book like you would other kids, and just kind of open it up and just assume that all the concepts are there, because there's also challenges with transference. So each week I'm working on all of those individual areas, slowly moving one up at a time, and then trying to weave it all into repertoire that's of an appropriate level. But again, organization is important, and being able to project down the future on each one of those individual activities.
I would agree 100%. And I think this is where the adaptive pedagogy comes in, if I can just add that point, and that music, for some of my students, that's a splinter skill, which, although they are excellent in music, they may have serious deficits in other areas in their education or in their cognitive development. So let's say if my student has an inability to really approach numbers, that doesn't mean that they can't play beautifully, rhythmically, and understand meter. They just need to understand it in another way. And so an example of that would be, instead of dealing with numbers in terms of meter and in terms of rhythm, just use what I call directive words, which that means a quarter, quarter, half note pattern might be play, 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 hold, which tells their body exactly how to move to make that rhythm actualized in sound at the keyboard. And that's something that they can do very, very well. And I just don't want to layer numbers on top of that if that's just a real problem area or a deficit that they can't approach. And so everything can begin to move. It just depends on how you approach it.
You know, students with autism sometimes tend to be occasionally exhibit some obsessiveness about certain subjects. And I've just happened to work with a lot of students with autism who are quite obsessed and really good at improvising. And so I've tried to use that as sort of a prize. You know, we will work on our improvisations when we get this scale fingering right. And so kind of finding a place to work on and sort of balancing it with things that they're really great at and really want to share with you can be a powerful motivating tool.
Great. Should we move on to methods? Okay. Do you use a specific method book? Why don't I just read all the questions and then we just can kind of weave in and respond to them as we go. Do you use a specific method book? What games are played to reinforce learning concepts? And those are the two questions. It's like way faster than I thought it was going to be.
Melissa hit on this a little while ago, but of individualizing things. In the beginning, I'm doing a lot of individualizing just so I can see where the child is learning, where they are in their learning process. As I get to learn and do things about or understand understand things about that child, I typically will use the Mozart Mouse and Beethoven Bear books that are part of the Alfred preschool series. I like that the music is one line long. They give a lot of time for reinforcement and repetition. But when I'm looking at a method, right now, all of the method books out there have too much on the page. So things are very distracting to my students. I have been known that after a family has purchased the book, I will take the book and copy things so that it's just the piece of music on the page and none of the extraneous stuff. Everyone has a lesson book and some kind of theory worksheet. And then when COVID started, we added composers of the month. And I've been driving around places dropping off candy bars when we fill in our sticker charts. Games are I individually come up with the games based on the child and based on what we're learning. But I do now, since I've been doing this for 20 years, I have a stockpile of games and it's not as overwhelming to come up with a new game because I typically could grab from what I have.
As far as method books go, I have my standard go-tos just like everyone else does, but I do a lot of supplementing because a lot of my students, they need far more repertoire at a certain level than is in any given method book. And I tend to go toward books and pieces that have very pattern-oriented pieces because they lend themselves very well to the breakdown and the step-by-step process. When it comes to games, like Beth, I take my cue from the students and I usually watch how they move, how they speak, the things that they say, or the sounds that they make, or their attention, because that shows me the way in to their thinking. And once I notice something that's repetitive in their behavior, we can often use that as a game to help them in their learning. Often, if I just kind of pull a standard music game out, it can be distracting. They may not be able to approach and learn how to play the game, or they may not be able to see the relationship between that game and what they're doing at the keyboard. And often the games that I use are creative music making, using improvisation to teach concepts before they will approach them in a book format with a label. So they understand them orally and physically before they have to approach the complexity of the label, the abstract complexity.
I think I would answer the first question here the same for any of my students, neurotypical or not. I don't use a specific method book because I think that is not sort of attending to a student's specific needs. And then I would second Scott's mentioning of improvisation. Different modal kinds of improvisations, 5-finger patterns, playing these things on 2 pianos, so there's a real rich sort of tonal palette, are all really great things. And Beth, East Lansing is right up the road from you. I would love a candy bar sometime.
Okay, I'll put yours in the mail because I also have a great relationship with our post office on the people who live farther. But send me your address. I'll send you your favorite candy bar.
It looks like our next slide is behavior. So I think when we get into that, we'll probably talk a little bit more about reinforcements. But for me, games aren't always the best way to sort of reinforce learning. Focusing on the activities is the best way to reinforce learning. And then when it's time to take a break, we use reinforcements that motivate the actual learning process. So, I have a student right now who's motivated by going into my living room and watching the fire in my pellet stove. In the summertime, he likes to go out and watch the hummingbirds or chase my cats around. So different things. I used to have a student who was motivated to drink a glass of water in between things. So finding out what works for your individual students, and then trying to reinforce learning concepts in the lesson with those reinforcements is sometimes more effective than implementing games. And then for methods, I kind of reiterate a lot of what Beth said. I don't work with a specific method book necessarily, but when I do find when it could take a year with a student before finding something that works. I also like the Little Mozart series. For some students, it works a little slow. For some students, they don't care about the narrative. But the music itself works well because it's slow, but I'll do the same thing. I'll often copy things out, cut out the distracting elements, and then color code where it makes sense to do so. Going into behavior, one of the other things I was just thinking as I was listening to my colleagues speak is that a lot of what we're trying to do right now is take what we do in the lesson and turn it into sort of an academic dialogue and an academic discussion, so that it's presented with, I think for me, far more intentionality than what actually happens in the moment. So when I have a kid that comes in, because I've been doing this for so long and because I've been so trained, and I'm so sort of used to doing it, most of what I do is intuitive. Like I've got a whole palette of resources and materials to call on in the moment. But when I'm in the moment, it's sloppy. And a lot of time it's just kind of moving really quick, especially if I have a kid who's got like high energy, and it's so much energetic work for me to stay on top of it and keep him in control. Otherwise he's impulsive and he'll make a mess in 2 seconds. In the moment, it's just working. It's just working on drive and intuition and experience. So I feel like that's one of the things that I need to sort of highlight here, is that we're all speaking from an academic way because we've been doing this for so long, but in the moment it's sloppy for all of us, and it's predominantly intuitive. So
Yeah, I agree, Melissa. I think there's a lot of in the moment, spur of the moment teaching, a lot of improvisation. That's the way it works.
mhm.
Yeah,
You
among
memorize.
ourselves, we all have a joke that whatever works, and we'll do whatever needs to be done in the moment.
And you
Uh,
just kind of memorize your kids' cues the more you work with them, and you know what the triggers are to potentially set off behavior, and you just don't bring it up. Or you know that if you don't give in. So I have one student that when we were in person teaching, I had to just give in, and he wasn't going to focus and he wasn't going to concentrate until he turned off the lights in the studio and said, "We turn off the lights and say surprise." And if you don't let him do it, it's a waste of time. So I guess that's why you've got to figure out, when do you give and just say, okay, fine, you can do it, versus when do you hold your ground and say, no, you're doing what I'm asking you to do it. And that comes over time. But yeah, it is messy. And there will be days when you go home and you're like, oh my gosh, what happened? And what in the world? And then you check in with the parent and you come and find out that it had nothing to do with piano, and it was something that happened on the bus 2 days ago, and we're still living it out in piano. So don't take personally anything that happens, is my point.
and I find that a lot of behavioral issues don't come up if I craft the lesson experience so that the student knows and has learned all of the appropriate behaviors that they're going to need to do from the minute they get out of the car to come up to the studio, from the minute they knock on the door. They know and have learned all of the behaviors. And I think Beth alluded to something a little earlier about her break card, where often our students we never know what's triggering them, but they know that there's a trigger coming up. And so if my student is starting to give me one of those cues, I take it seriously because they're telling me they just need some time.
They need to, yes. And I also have rules, which probably those, you guys know me really well, and I'm a control freak, but I have rules in the studio. And these rules are crafted similarly to what I'm seeing when I go into schools or what the schools talk about. And they're very simple, and they're 2 to 3 words, where quiet mouth, because we need to play with a quiet mouth. Hands on the piano, feet toward the floor. Very simple things. Hands to self. And sometimes I've had children, when I didn't have those rules in place, because I wasn't figuring out what was upsetting them, they would come to grab my hand, and you think, oh, they're going to hurt you. And no, they're not going to hurt you. It's a frustration because they can't physically get out the words to tell you what's bothering them. Everything they understand in their brain. So these rules help keep them on track. They also know that if we break a rule, we could maybe not get our sticker on the sticker chart. I've worked out some prearranged thing with a parent so that many of my kids like to earn screen time on their iPad, or time to go for a walk or do something that's non-school related, therapy related. And if they do something or misbehave in piano, they lose that. I also have a stoplight on my wall. Everyone starts the day on green. You get a warning. And then if you continue to not listen or to continue to not make good choices, it goes up to yellow. And if it goes up to red, they know that I will be talking to mom or dad and telling them what happened in the lesson if mom and dad are not there.
One thing that Melissa often says, which really sticks with me, is that all behavior is communication.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not verbal speech, the student is still communicating something. And on the on the undesirable end of the spectrum, that if I do have a behavior that is just too disruptive, uncontrollable, that's why I feel like the parent is important there. And often, and this rarely happens, I will end the lesson and tell them we need to end the lesson, why, and then I always follow up and say, you are welcome back next week if the behavior has been addressed. And then I usually follow that up with an email and a phone call just to really let the parents know that, hey, I love you, I love your kid. I want them back at the lesson as soon as possible, but can we address this thing that I am not able to address by myself? And sometimes that is also manifesting in other areas of that child's life. So it's being dealt with on many different fronts. But I just want them to know that, yes, you're welcome back at any time, but we've got to nip this one in the bud first.
And back on what you're saying, sometimes when those undesirable behaviors happen, and like Scott said, it's rare, the student's embarrassed. They know it's upsetting, and they will, and I'll end the lesson and say, Miss Beth is not mad. Miss Beth is frustrated with what happened, and we will try harder next week. You'll usually get a text message, an email, a phone call with a message saying, Miss Beth, I'm sorry I was naughty at lesson. I will do better next week. And if you do get said text or said email or said phone call, you better address it within 24 hours so that they know you heard it. And you can always say, thank you for your apology. I accept your apology. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next week at our lesson. And I even give them an opportunity to say, would you like to video what you were supposed to play for me and send it to me in a text message? And you can still have a redo to get your sticker.
Sorry, go ahead, Derek.
Well, just really briefly, these are all such great suggestions. Also, I really appreciate, Melissa, you starting this out by saying that, you don't have to have this all figured out. I certainly don't have it all figured out when it comes to behavior, and teachers should not shy away with working with these students because they're worried about these behavior things. These are things to learn and things to grow from. I think the one thing that I have figured out is with students with autism who are high functioning, something that tends to come up a lot are these sort of no filter comments, comments that would be sort of socially inappropriate for most people. And, when this would first happen in lessons, I would kind of ignore it and just move on awkwardly. And that really didn't address things. And then I started to just sort of correct it. And that also kind of didn't have a really great outcome typically. But one thing that I have discovered with those comments is to, first of all, tell the student, I really appreciate you being honest with me. I think honesty is appropriate, is very important in relationships between people. So this came up recently when a student just told me that my studio was a mess. It was. But then I'll follow that up by saying, I just want to let you know that there are situations when we use those kind of comments and situations when we don't. And this is probably a situation when in the future, you don't want to speak that way. You don't want to bring this comment up in that certain way. So it becomes kind of a good behavioral learning situation for that student. But that's one behavior thing that I feel like I've gotten better at over the years.
Plus, you're also communicating that your studio is a safe place and that you're not going to hold it against them, but that they can try it out on you, and you will be honest enough to say, I appreciate your honesty and you telling me, but I wouldn't do that for your teacher at school. That might get you in trouble. Something like that.
Right.
So we've got about 10 minutes before we've hit the hour mark. I will say that I just before this one recorded a session on behavior where a lot of this stuff is kind of grazed over. There's a little more nuance in this dialogue, so I would sort of take note of this. But just in summary, I think being proactive is really critically important, setting the expectations in advance, keeping a routine, keeping a schedule, anything you can do to prevent the behavior from happening in the first place is always the best way to go. So I think the next slide, I'm sorry, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, I just wanted to echo what Beth said about the safe space and being the safe person for these kids. It's so important.
Yeah, totally. Especially because music is like the fun thing. It's the thing that has so many benefits, but also it's an engaging activity on a really fun, enjoyable level. Physical technique. How do you approach teaching correct hand position? How do you teach balance between the hands?
This is hard
Mm-hmm.
with my kids, especially because most of my kids have fine motor deficits or challenges where they're in occupational therapy. They may have physical therapy challenges too. So the way you do it is not through talking like you would with, and that you probably remember back from your lessons. I find exercises are things that we do. So I briefly mentioned earlier that we might throw balls against the wall, but the balls are in the shape, all right, they have to hold the ball a certain way, and I make them do it with both their dominant hand and their non-dominant hand because we use both hands in piano. Balance can be hard, but you can do it. We do a lot with, which hand has the melody. If we know what that is, which hand doesn't have the melody. So which hand should be louder than the other. And then we keep practicing on it.
This is like just a larger pedagogical thing for me. I think that every pianist has their sound inside of them, and they get that sound through a different technique. They get that sound through a different shape of their hand or a different way they approach the keyboard. And so instead of focusing on something like a correct way to put your hand on the piano, I like to explore sound with students and to say, can we get a smooth sound here? Can we get an angry sound here? And I always find that these students have this very intuitive way of using their hands, maybe unconventionally, to create very imaginative kind of sounds.
Well, I think like Melissa just previously said about how she recorded a session on behaviors for this track of Pedagogy Saturday, I also recorded a 30-minute session on teaching mechanics and technique. And so if you, I would just like to refer to that as my answer.
Fair enough. And then I guess maybe the only thing I would add would be that sometimes it just takes time. Sometimes it might take a student months, years to really develop the physical capacity to do what your expectations are. So I think keeping that perspective is critical, and then just slowly kind of building your way towards the ideal is one way to do it. Reading, it's just one question. What are some good ways to approach learning to read music?
I just finished a session on this, and I have 4 strategies that I gave.
Watch that session.
Yeah, so there, I'll just plug my session. Feel free to go watch that, and I will be quiet on this one.
And I would just also like to add, we have 3 posts in the Inclusive Piano Teaching blog that deal specifically with music reading as well, and that's free of charge. And you're welcome to just Google Inclusive Piano Teaching, and you'll find it at those links.
I forgot we did those, so that's a good reminder. I think that you can find a good blend between rote teaching in engaging the sort of auditory processing that some kids are really strong in, and also learning to read. And watch Beth's session. and read the blog. Look, all the content is there, so should we move on? The next slide is on rhythm, and Beth and I are recording one on rhythm. So some activities for steady beat and playing different rhythms. I would say we can nuance it a little bit here, but Beth and I are going to go into it with a little bit more detail for our session. But Derek and Scott, do you have anything to say about rhythm activities?
I just have had some success with just playing along with a student, if a student is stopping between measures or is just sort of playing in a arrhythmic way, I just, making up a little accompaniment on the second piano and doing something that is rhythmically engaging and keeps things moving forward in a way where you're not explaining everything and you're just getting them to experience it I've found that to be powerful.
And also, many of my students, they have fine motor skill deficits as well. And that's where I always go back to the directive words of using words that show them how the counting can be achieved through movements of the body, the play, 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 hold for a quarter, quarter, half note pattern. And then, we have all these weird words that we use in music study, like steady beat, which if you think about those words, steady beat, they are very, very context specific. And so I do a lot of work making sure that my student understands what that vocabulary actually means and what it means in context and how to achieve it through physical motions. And then once we get over that understanding bridge of the vocabulary, then things seem to work out much better. Often they just don't understand our specific vocabulary, the meanings of the words, or the context. And so I do a lot of time building that bridge first.
Great. The last PowerPoint slide is recital preparation. How do you prepare students? I don't know about spring recitals. COVID has sort of obliterated all of that. Although I am kind of liking the Zoom recital thing, because when you do it, you can invite parents from all over the country or family members from all over the country, which has been pretty awesome. But how do you deal with, I think we've done this before, and Beth has some great techniques for preparing students for recitals. So maybe we can start there and then other people can chime in.
So the bow that I told you for starting the lesson and ending the lesson, I'm doing that purposefully so that when we get to the point of the recital, that we bow before we play our piece and we bow after we play our piece, that we're working on making sure we have a bow that looks good. The other thing that I do is I have a duct tape X in my studio, and that's where we bow. When they come to the recital, there's a duct tape X on the floor where they should stand to take their bow. I also have both a board maker and word schedule that tells them exactly what the schedule is going to look like for the recital. And it's very simple. When I get to the recital, I sit with mom and dad. When it is my turn, I walk to the piano. I take a bow. Then I play my piece. I take a bow. I go sit with mom and dad. And my recital is always the last week in April. Well, except this year. I don't know when it is. So I give them this schedule in January. My kids love schedules. They love repeating them. They've seen the tape for years, and they have the exact same duct tape. I don't use a new one because that would be too confusing, or that would say someone would look at me on the side, on the wings of the recital floor and say, Miss Beth, this is not the right tape. So I just never choose the wrong tape. The other thing we do is we pick our pieces in January, and they know that this is their piece, and we look for places for them to perform their piece besides the recital. And many times they will play them for grandma and grandpa. They might play them at school. They might play them at church. Just, we find different venues so that it helps to lower anxiety.
So we've got about 1 minute left.
Well, can I just add there, Melissa? We kind of had a theme of referring to other things. There's a post on recital preparation in the Inclusive Piano Teaching blog, and another session on this piano pedagogy inclusive track for Pedagogy Saturday revolves around creating inclusive and adaptive events for students who are special learners, and also creating adjudicated events for students who are special learners. So I would refer you to that session as well, because there will be a lot more detailed information than what we can give in this short time.
Excellent. So I guess maybe we'll just stop it here. We usually get questions, but obviously that's not an option. So I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to stop the video recording.
Well, thank you all very, very much for being here today to share your expertise. And thank you all out there for viewing this session. and for the work that you do. You really are doing incredible hero level work just by being there for your students and adapting to this process. So thank you very much for all the work that you do. You are important. What you do is important, and who you are is important, and don't let anyone tell you differently.
Bye, everyone.